So it's my great pleasure again to introduce Professor John Wyatt, an old friend going back over many years. John is Emeritus Professor of Neonatal Pediatrics at the University College London and a senior researcher at the Faraday Institute in Cambridge, and also president of the UK Christian Medical Fellowship, which is one of ICMDA's member organizations. John has a clinical background as a pediatrician, caring for sick and premature infants, and also as a medical scientist, researching into the prevention of brain injury in newborn babies. He's always been interested in ethical dilemmas raised by advances in medical technology and has frequently engaged in public and professional consultations and debates from the perspective of the Christian faith. His perhaps best known book, Matters of Life and Death, Human Dilemmas in the Light of the Christian Faith, has been translated into more than 10 languages. And his most recent book, with an intriguing title, The Robot Will See You Now, is now available on Amazon. He's also contributed a chapter to a book called Healthy Faith and the Coronavirus Crisis. And John and his wife Celia are long-standing members of All Souls Church in London. So John, lovely to have you back here, and we look forward to hearing you on euthanasia and assisted suicide. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. It's great to be here again and to be able to have this amazing opportunity by technology to be involved in a conversation and discussion around the world. So I look forward to getting Q&A and issues that we can discuss further. So my goal in this talk is really to look at recent developments in the area of euthanasia and assisted suicide. I'm not going to talk about the basic ethical issues. I'm going to take that for read, and of course they are available in other webinars and also in some of my writing, including books such as Matters of Life and Death and Right to Die ? So I'm just going to be looking at particular things which strike me about the way that the debate is moving on across the world. But I want to start by pointing out this extraordinary inconsistency and contradiction you get in modern thinking, because on the one hand we have a very serious move to try to extend life as long as possible, with the goal being, if at all possible, to extend human life indefinitely. And what's interesting is that a lot of this is coming out of Silicon Valley, where you've got some extremely rich entrepreneurs who are used to throwing money at their biggest problems. And what's apparent is that many of these Silicon Valley entrepreneurs are terrified of dying, and therefore they are throwing enormous billions of money into medical research, into tackling aging and ultimately life extension and trying to defeat death. And Calico is one example of a company funded by Google, which is doing leading research into life extension. Another example of this is the so-called cryonics, where you can have your body immersed in liquid nitrogen in the forlorn hope that you are actually going to be preserved so that a future generation will come across this corpse in liquid nitrogen and will decide to resuscitate it with whatever technology is available in the future hope. And there are, particularly in California, you get these vats are filled with liquid nitrogen, and inside you've got to imagine all these bodies suspended in the hope that sometimes they're going to be resuscitated. So on the one hand, you get this extraordinary preoccupation with extending life, and on the other hand, we get this growth of various forms of medical killing. So just very recently, The Economist magazine had this article about so-called assisted dying. And they make the statement that in the West, assisted dying is rapidly becoming legal and accepted. And certainly The Economist magazine uses its considerable authority to argue in favor of that. They're saying it's about time. This fits in with their liberal agenda. We need to make assisted dying, it needs to be recognized that various forms of medical killing should now become legal and accepted. And as The Economist magazine said, it's raising hard questions and changing how people think about death. And certainly one of the obvious phenomena which you see in all the places where various forms of medical killing have been legalized is this very interesting and progressive rise in numbers. So these are numbers from the Netherlands showing this progressive increase, and that increase has continued up to the present statistics. And we see this in terms of the euthanasia cases by diagnosis. We see that starting in 2002, when euthanasia was legalized in the Netherlands, the vast majority of cases involve cancer, whereas if you come to the latest in this slide in 2016, you can see that there are now a lot of other conditions for which euthanasia is being carried out. And this again seems to be a trend, a broadening of the diagnostic categories. Canada, I think, is particularly interesting and chilling in the very rapid rise in euthanasia cases. Very interesting that in Canada, this is called medical aid in dying. 99% of the cases are actually euthanasia, lethal injection by a doctor causing instantaneous death, and only 1% involve oral administration. In contrast to places like the Oregon state or Washington state in the USA, where it's entirely self-administered lethal medication. So you get these very interesting and illogical differences in practice in different countries. There's a lot of detail on this slide, but it shows the reasons given for euthanasia in Canada. And again, this reflects the same in many different places across the world. It's often not about pain. The top here is loss of ability to engage in meaningful life activities, loss of ability to perform activities of daily living, and perceived burden on family, loss of dignity, isolation or loneliness. So although pain is in there, representing concern about pain, about 50%, in many cases, people are going for euthanasia because of a sense of fear of dependence, fear of meaninglessness of life, and so on. And in Canada also, and I think this is in some ways reflects what may well would happen in the UK, in a very regulated health service in Canada, as soon as the law was passed, then care pathways have been created, which then enable, which give guidance to clinical teams. And so euthanasia is seen very much as a treatment option for all patients with distressing symptoms or terminal illness. And it ends up down at the bottom of the care pathway with the administration of the lethal injection. In Switzerland, these are statistics showing the rise in suicide in Switzerland. And it's interesting that the principal rise of suicide in Switzerland has actually been amongst Swiss residents, which are the dark red in this graph, going up. It's increasing fourfold from 2003 to 2016, although there is also an increase in the number of suicides occurring at Dignitas with foreign residents. So here in the UK, we've had many attempts to legalize, legislative attempts to legalize various forms of assisted suicide. And the latest is the so-called Assisted Dying Bill, which was debated in the House of Lords just in October. And here, the criteria for which lethal medicine can be legally given would be age 18 or over, a settled and, quote, uncoerced will to kill themselves, a life expectancy of less than 6 months, and legally defined capacity. And it's interesting that in the legislation, in the proposed legislation in the UK, there is no mention of suffering, which is very different from, for instance, in the Netherlands, where hopeless and unbearable suffering is an essential criteria. So again, it's quite fascinating to see that the different legislative approaches are fundamentally incompatible. In places like the Netherlands and Canada, you have to have hopeless and unbearable suffering, but you don't have any limitations in terms of life expectancy. In Oregon and in what's proposed in England and Wales, you have to have a terminal illness with less than 6 months to live, but you don't have to have any degree of suffering. I had the privilege of working with CARE and with CMF, the Christian Medical Fellowship in the UK. CARE is a Christian charity in the UK, in providing a report on assisted dying, which I did under my own name and which was given to 500 members of the House of Lords just in the week prior to the debate. And I'm currently working on a version of this book to be made available, which will be published generally, I hope, within the next couple of months, just basically making the arguments about why legalization of assisted dying or assisted suicide is not an appropriate way for us to go. But as we look around the world, again, what we see is the way that this progressive liberalization of legal of laws, unfortunately, is absolutely predictable. So the Dutch Supreme Court addressed the question of whether euthanasia was appropriate for dementia patients, and they have concluded that patients can put an advance statement that they wish to receive euthanasia if they know that they are being diagnosed with dementia, and such that at a later stage, when the dementia is advanced, they can be killed by a doctor without having to have any express desire to kill themselves. And indeed, there was a tragic case in the Netherlands several years ago where somebody had written an advance statement like this, saying that they had a horror of developing dementia, and if they ever developed dementia, they wished to be killed. And then when the person did in fact develop dementia, when they were asked if they were ready to be killed, they said no, and they repeatedly said no. And eventually the doctor felt that it was his duty, quotes, to administer a lethal injection to the patient, even though the patient was resisting and said they didn't, and had to, apparently, according to the reports, had to be held down in order to receive the lethal injection. This case went to the courts, was challenged, but the courts ultimately defended the doctor and saying that it was the advanced statement of the patient that was legally binding. So the Dutch have gone down this direction, and it seems that Canada is also going down this in this direction. So in Canada, the legal framework is what's called medical aid in dying, and this was legalized earlier on in 2016, when the initial law was developed. But in March 2021, the law has been amended quite radically and liberalized. So now, whereas previously the medical aid in dying bill said that death had to be reasonably foreseeable, this was subject to repeated test cases, and the law has now been amended so that clause has been removed. There's no requirement for death to be reasonably foreseeable, and that means that people can, with a chronic disabling condition, can argue that if they have significant suffering, that they can be killed however long their life expectancy. There's also no need to give final consent prior to the procedure, and therefore for people with Alzheimer's or other degenerative conditions, they can write advance directives years in advance, which would be then carried out. Medical aid in dying is going to be made available for people with psychiatric conditions from 2023, and they are actively looking in Canada at whether or not to enable medical aid in dying for so-called mature minors. These would be people under the age of 18 who have some form of legal capacity. So again, we see this consistent theme that once law is enacted, it is progressively liberalized and the criteria are increased. And it's interesting just to look at the rhetoric. I was just looking at some rhetoric of news reports about this in Canada. And for many people, this is a wonderful thing. For people with dementia, changes in the medical aid in dying law offer new hope. Changes to Bill C7 have released people with dementia from a cruel trap by letting them make provisions in advance to end their lives. So there are many people who are hailing this as a great advance in medical law, that people with dementia are able to make binding advance directions for them to be killed at a later stage in their life. Another interesting and slightly bizarre development is the idea of combining euthanasia with organ donation, and this is now actually being actively pursued in Canada as well as in Belgium. And in fact, the transplant authorities in Canada are positively promoting this option, because it's seen as a win-win. Not only can you solve the problem of ending your own life, but at the same time, if it's done in a properly controlled manner, you can donate organs. And the idea is to try to commit to ensure that the euthanasia is carried out in a way which maximizes the opportunity for so-called, quotes, harvesting organs in good condition. And it appears to be another development. And in Ontario, a man chose a medically assisted death at home. He had been diagnosed with Huntington's disease, although he was in a pre-symptomatic stage, or a relatively pre-symptomatic stage, and he decided he just wanted to be killed, but he chose to do it in advance so that he could donate organs with the transplant team. Another really concerning trend in Canada, and seen elsewhere as well, is the merging between palliative care and various forms of euthanasia. So historically, palliative care and the philosophy behind palliative care is seen as something entirely antithetical, entirely different from euthanasia. But what we are now seeing is the growth and the pressure on palliative care services to actually enable euthanasia to be carried out as well on their premises. And so it's a sort of choice. If you have a terminal illness, you can have palliative care, but if at any time it seems that the symptoms have become too distressing, then you can choose euthanasia. And there's a lot of pressure from euthanasia campaigners to ensure that palliative care facilities also enable various forms of euthanasia. And there's also been pressure on institutions. So in Canada, there are a number of independent Catholic hospitals who provide services within the state-funded health services, and they've been there's been pressure on the Catholic hospitals to say that unless they provide this kind of service, then they will not be able to continue to have funding from the state. So extremely severe pressure both on hospitals and also on individuals. And there is a great deal of concern that individual doctors are also being bullied, although in theory there is the right of conscience and protection for physicians. In reality, there can be intense pressure on physicians to participate and to inform patients about the option for medical aid in dying, and to participate in referrals and so on. And I don't think it's going to end there. It's already interesting that in the Netherlands, the debate has moved on. Really, the debate about euthanasia in cancer and so on is regarded as passé. It's not worth continuing because euthanasia is an accepted option. The debate has moved on, and in particular, there's a lot of pressure on the doctors to provide euthanasia for older people who are, quote, tired of life. In other words, they don't have any recognizable medical condition, but they have decided that their life, to end their lives, they want to commit suicide effectively, but they want to do it with medical help. And so far, the Dutch doctors and the Dutch Medical Association has resisted this. They've discussed it, but said this is not a medical role. We exist to treat patients who have a recognizable illness. We're not here to end the lives of people who are simply tired of life. But there's a lot of pressure, and it looks as though the political pressure is starting to increase to extend the law further. So I just want to step back then from this sort of overview. I think if we just look across the world, I'm afraid we can see many new legislations bringing in or discussing assisted suicide law, including Spain, New Zealand, and a number of other countries across the world. It seems that this is an inexorable spread which is taking place across the world. It's worth stepping back and just looking at why this is happening. And in particular, there are some extremely well-funded and effective lobbying organizations around the world. In the UK, this organization used to be called the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, but it changed its name about 15 years ago and became Dignity in Dying. And the name change, of course, is highly significant. You would think that an organization called Dignity in Dying was devoted towards improving care of dying people, ensuring that they receive excellent palliative care, and so on. But in fact, Dignity in Dying has only one sole aim, ultimately, and that is to lobby and politicians to change the law and to support people who are wishing to end their lives either through assisted suicide or through euthanasia. And they have become extremely effective lobbying organizations, and there are similar organizations like this across the world. And one of the things to notice is the way that nearly all of these organizations use euphemistic or gentle but misleading language. Perhaps the Dutch are an honorable exception. I mean, the Dutch are famously known to be rather blunt and direct speaking in their nature, and I think it's to their tribute that they talk about. They're quite blunt about talking about euthanasia and assisted suicide. But most other countries choose to use much more euphemistic and gentle and misleading language. So these are the kind of phrases: death with dignity, that's what it's called in Oregon; assisted dying, this is what it's called in the UK and elsewhere, which is a deliberately manipulative and misleading term; medical aid in dying, that's what it's called in Canada; ensuring a dignified death, the right to choose, easing the passing, ending suffering when it becomes unbearable, choice and control over how we die, and so on. All of these terms are describing intentional killing and medical intentional killing. And yet it's worth asking the question, why is it that campaigners are so careful to use this language, including, philosophers and lawyers whose whole career is dedicated to very precise use of language? Why is it this kind of language? And I think it illustrates of how important language is to us as human beings and as moral beings. The language we use to describe our behavior matters. And therefore, if I, as a physician, describe my behavior as killing my patient, as ending the life of my patient, then I am likely to interpret that differently if I describe my actions as I'm just assisting dying, I'm ending suffering. So the language we use about our behavior really matters. And I like this ancient proverb that the beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper name. And so I think in trying to resist this, the spread of medical killing, we have to be careful about our language and trying to use our language to use accurate and non-misleading language. And so I think we should be clear that euthanasia is intentional medical killing of a person as part of their medical treatment or care, so called. And so the important thing is that the intention is to end life. It is to introduce death into a patient who is not dying, who is not actively dying, in whom the end of life is not occurring. The intention is to end life quickly and cleanly. And medically assisted suicide, the intention is the same. The doctor's intention is that the patient should die rapidly and cleanly. And you can see that in the choice of drugs. The main drugs that are used across the world are massive doses of barbiturates, often coupled in lethal injection with a muscle relaxant. But it's interesting that, and quite grisly, that in Oregon, now doctors are increasingly using a very toxic mixture of very large doses of digoxin and propranolol, highly cardiotoxic combination of drugs which are designed to cause rapid arrhythmias and cardiac arrest. So the intention to kill is very clear by the choice of drugs. Of course, these drugs are not used at all in palliative care. And the arguments, I think, can be distilled down. The two major arguments are compassion. I'm such a caring person that I have to help you kill yourself to end your suffering. Or autonomy. Every person has the right to choose the time and the manner of their death. These are the two dominant arguments that are used time and time again by campaigners. And there have been a number of prominent Christian leaders who have come out, a small number, but nonetheless significant. One of the most prominent of all is the ex-Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Carey, who has come out using the argument from compassion, arguing that it's the compassionate thing to do is to help people to kill themselves if they are in, quotes, unbearable suffering. I like this quote from H.L. Mencken, an American journalist, who said, "There's always an easy solution to every human problem, neat, plausible, and wrong." And that's what euthanasia and assisted suicide, that's what they are. They seem so neat, they seem so plausible, but they're wrong. And ultimately we have, I believe, to stand up against this and argue the case that there is no need to kill the patient in order to kill the pain. So as I come to the end of my talk, how do we respond to this threat of legalized medical killing, which I'm afraid, humanly speaking, does seem to be spreading inexorably across the globe? I think that public education is absolutely central to this. People just are very, very ignorant about appropriate care at the end of life. And so we have a huge task as physicians and healthcare professionals to educate people about the realities of end-of-life care and about how effective palliative care is. I mean, I was saddened to hear in the House of Lords debate just last month repeated tragic stories of people dying in agony, wanting to kill themselves. But the point was not made clearly that actually none of these people were receiving effective palliative care. And that if you see, the very best quality palliative care that can be provided, you realize that actually this huge levels of distress and agony can be almost entirely eradicated, or at least very significantly ameliorated. So there is a huge task of public education, and particularly we need to provide information and advice for politicians and legislators. I think that doctors and healthcare professionals have a special role in ensuring that politicians and legislators understand what the issues are and understand the priority of funding palliative care rather than introducing various forms of medical killing. But I think we also need realistically to start considering contingency plans for resilience and resistance in case legislation does come in. Just on the question of public education, there's a number of studies which have shown how confused people are. This is data that came from the Netherlands that showing that large numbers of people are confused about what the legalization of assisted dying actually means. So significant numbers of people thought that assisted dying included turning off life support, withdrawing or withholding life support treatments. They thought assisted dying meant stopping medical tests and medical treatments. And they thought that assisted dying included do not resuscitate orders. Well, of course, as we know, all of those three things are well-recognized part of ethical medical care and are available at the moment in most advanced medical jurisdictions across the world. So it's the confusion about what assisted dying actually represents is a very important part in the whole debate. With regard to resilience and resistance, I think we need to develop and promote the arguments about defending conscience rights for physicians, other healthcare practitioners, and health institutions. So this is very evident in places, particularly in Canada, that the pressures that there are on both physicians and others and institutions who are resisting this. So I think we really need to argue the case so that even if euthanasia is legalized, the conscience rights for those who are opposed to it are strongly protected. I think we need to really consider how to create euthanasia-free zones within state-funded healthcare systems. And finally, I think if euthanasia is legalized in different countries, we need to seriously think about creating independent Christian or pro-life or Hippocratic euthanasia-free healthcare services. And finally, I want to mention, of course, the spiritual element behind all this, the spiritual battle. Jesus says in John chapter 8, you belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Very, very strong language. And we see here these two characteristics of the evil one. First, he's a murderer. And we see this in this battle. The battle is about killing. It's about the destruction of precious lives. And secondly, the evil one is a liar. The battle is about truth, lies, and the manipulation of language. So yes, we need to be good in promoting educational material, but we mustn't forget that in a spiritual battle, prayer is the most vital weapon. And so we need to encourage the churches, the Christians, the intercessors in our churches to see this as a spiritual battle and to engage against the forces of darkness, the murderer and the liar. So finally, I like the profound words of G.K. Chesterton. It's easy, isn't it? When confronted with this, I'm sorry it's such a grisly topic, and it's a pretty depressing topic as we see medical killing spreading across the world. G.K. Chesterton said there are two equal and opposite sins against Christian hope. The sin of presumption, to assume that everything is going to go okay, and the sin of despair. And they're both sins. Instead, we need to practice the daily discipline of Christian hope. Hope is to hear the melody of the future, and faith is to dance to that melody in the present. May God help us to hang on to that hope, to hear that melody, and to dance to the melody as we face these challenges. So I'm hoping this book, as I said, will be available. It's not available at the moment, but it should come available within the next couple of months. And there are more resources on my website, johnwyatt.com, and these are the books that are relevant to this topic. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John. We've been listening to Professor John Wyatt talking about trends in euthanasia and assisted suicide. So, John, first of all, I just wonder, what's your impression on how awake the church is, generally in the West or globally, to the kind of trends that you are outlining here? And how engaged is the church, do you think, in trying to oppose these trends?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, there are one or two honourable exceptions, and I think I was encouraged that once Christians are informed, for instance, in the House of Lords debate, there were a number of very good contributions from bishops, including the current Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, and others. So I think there is some awareness amongst Christian leaders, but I have to say, generally, I'm afraid, I think there is a deep level of ignorance. And in fact, I think there are many Christians who are secretly in favour of euthanasia. They have bought the propaganda. They wouldn't say it publicly, but they think, if I was in terrible pain and someone was offering me a way out, I'd take it, And so I think there is a huge task of education within the churches. And I mean, part of the problem is that people just don't want to talk about death. I mean, it's such a painful, difficult topic. I mean, much better to change the subject. And so, to stare at death and to think about one's own dying and all that kind of stuff, there's a lot of resistance to that. And so I think we do have a big task. I think it's interesting that a whole number of studies have shown that the nearer you get to actually caring for dying people, the more likely you are to be opposed to legalization of euthanasia. So,
and why do you think that is? Why is that? This is often said. Why are the doctors who are closest to the dying patient, people like palliative medicine specialists, why do you think they're much more opposed to a change in the law than other doctors or the general population?
I think the sad truth is, well, perhaps it's not a sad truth. The reality is that most people have no experience of watching people die. Death has become, whereas it used to be completely routine. Every family would have watched children die. They would have watched elder people die. They all died at home. They died surrounded by their loved ones. There was a whole emphasis on what it meant to die well. What's happened over the last 50 years is that death has become increasingly medicalized. It's something that is taken out of normal experience, and it all happens in hospitals, surrounded by professionals, and people just don't want to think about it. They're not interested in it. They have no experience with it. And so in that setting, it's just not possible it's very difficult for, quote, ordinary people to have a realistic understanding of what it's like to die. If they've never watched somebody, they've never been involved. And so, we all have the experience of, if you talk to somebody, young, fit person, over a meal or something like that, and the discussion turns to this, they will say, very commonly people say, well, if I knew I had a terminal illness, I'd say I've had a good life, just if I'd want to die, give me the tablets, doc. But we all know that actually when you are dealing with people who are facing death, it's very, very different. And therefore there is an argument that it's just not possible to prepare yourself in advance unless you've been there. And the only people who've really had a lot of experience of that are palliative care doctors, by and large, who've walked alongside people who are dying and who've really engaged with them. And so I think we have to trust the people who have the most experience. And that's why, to be honest, I think, isn't it sad that Lord Carey, who has had no experience of caring for dying people is using his influence to argue for a change in the law, whereas there's so many Christian doctors who are working with people at the end of the life who are arguing against it.
Absolutely. And you were talking about the lobby that's pushing for this, because this is, people often talk about a slippery slope, don't they? But I think I prefer the term incremental extension, because there is certainly an active campaign, a movement all around the world really to push legislation on this area that's very well funded. You mentioned dignity in dying and so on. Is this a similarly well-organized lobby against euthanasia? How much of the church is involved in it, and what could we do to,
Yes,
to improve it?
I mean, it's almost tragic to see the difference between the funding that's available for these pro-euthanasia groups compared with the funding of the anti-euthanasia groups. I mean, here in the UK, the annual turnover of Dignity in Dying, according to their published accounts, is I think approaching £2 million a year, and they have tens of professional staff solely dedicated to promoting this. If you look at, by comparison, the equivalent organization Care Not Killing, has a turnover of less than 100,000. I mean, it's sort of more than 20 to 1 in terms of funding. I mean, so if you talk about equality of armaments in the battle, it's tragically unequal. And so I think there is a question about how to try to ensure that we try to counter these very well-funded groups. I think the truth is that there are a whole group of older people who have done very well, the so-called baby boomers, who are now coming to the end of their life, and they've made a lot of money in their careers as professionals and so on, and they're now pouring money. They believe that this campaign is something because they're terrified of their own death, and so they're pouring money into it, whereas raising money to oppose this, I think, is a much harder ask, isn't it?
Yeah. Are there discussions in any countries about who should offer euthanasia? I was struck by your comment that there was some resistance among Dutch doctors to the idea of offering it to people who are just tired of life, as opposed to having some medical condition. But are there discussions about it being offered outside the healthcare system, for example, or if not, why is there so much pressure from lobbyists to make it part of medicine?
It's a very, very interesting question. And you could argue, and of course I've made this argument, I think you've made the same argument, Peter, that the medical profession is the last profession on the planet to be involved in medical killing. Because it's the medical profession, right from its earliest days, which committed itself to the protection of human life, to use its skill always to cure and to heal, and never to harm or to kill. So why not create a new discipline of euthanasiologists and just train them in how to kill people? And why not protect it entirely from the medical profession? And it is interesting that in the proposed bill, in the assisted dying bill, it all revolves around the doctor. The doctor has to inform the patients, has to ensure that they are not coerced, has to assess them, their capacity. The doctor has to prescribe drugs. The doctor has to advise. The doctor has to make sure that the drugs have been properly taken. The doctor has to report the case, and so on and so on. It's all based around the medical duty. So the question is, well, why? And the answer is very clear: because the public don't trust anybody else to do the killing. The idea of having professional, neutral killers is anathema to the public, the general public. The public have built up in the idea that it's doctors who and the healthcare professionals who are the most trusted members of society. And if we're going to trust anybody with a lethal injection, it has to be the doctors. We're not going to trust anybody else. We're certainly not going to trust lawyers. We're not going to trust politicians. We're not going to trust philosophers. We're not going to trust police officers. Who are we going to trust? Well, we'll trust that nice, friendly family doctor.
I guess medicalizing it to some extent makes it more acceptable and palatable too to the legislators. Charlotte Smith here is asking a question. She says, we've seen in the UK how the abortion law, which was initially intended only for a small number of desperate cases, has escalated to become an extension of contraceptive services in a sense. And she's saying, is there the same concern with assisted suicide and euthanasia that once legalized, it could just become an alternative to appropriate social care or even be used to save money? Is there any evidence of this happening in countries where it has been legalized?
Well, I'm absolutely certain that that is the long-term direction. It's as you put it, it's an incremental extension, and we should recognize that this legislation has only been around for a relatively short time in a relatively small number of countries. But if the Netherlands, if you take the Netherlands as the place where it has the longest history, then that move towards social engineering, if you like, seems very clear. And I think there is absolutely no doubt that once this becomes regarded as a treatment option, for instance, there's no doubt that if the assisted dying bill was passed in the UK, every one of the 300,000 or more terminally ill patients in the NHS, every one would be legally, there would be a legal duty for the doctors to inform them that suicide was an option. And so we would have 300,000 people considering the possibility of suicide. And, you know, if one extrapolates to the forward, and particularly when you think about things like the rise of dementia, you think about care costs at the end of life, you think about concerns about how society is going to cope with increasing numbers of elderly people, it doesn't take a genius to see that the social pressures on elderly people to do the decent thing. I mean, one could even imagine a kind of incentive scheme, couldn't you? You know, you could refuse some form of euthanasia, of course, but, you know, if you were to agree, you know, we would give you some enormous handout in advance and we would make payment to your relatives and so on, because you're doing the decent thing. You're doing the altruistic thing. You don't want to be a burden to others. You don't want to be a burden to the state. You're doing the right thing. Like you know, it doesn't take a genius to see how the arguments in that will develop.
Yes, I guess once euthanasia is seen as a treatment option, it's going to get costed, isn't it? And compared with other treatment options. Ian Lacey's asked a couple of questions here that are related. The first one is, why don't we make sufficient palliative care available? And he says in the UK, there's a problem where most palliative care is funded through the charitable sector, not the NHS. But he's also asking the question, given that with the way society is changing, people are spending more time in poor health, particularly at the end of life, and most health spending goes at the end of life. And given the relative cheapness of barbiturates against alternatives, is there a real danger that health economists and health managers and politicians might see that there's a real economic incentive, if you like, to be pushing this as a treatment option?
Yes, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think it's utterly outrageous that in a rich country like the UK, you know, with something like the fifth strongest economy in the world, that we fund a large amount of care for the dying by people shaking tins and going around trying to raise with fundraising events, you know. And so the NHS pours literally billions of money into very, very sophisticated experimental treatments to try and prolong life by a few weeks or months, and yet we can't properly fund resource palliative care services. I mean, it's completely outrageous. And yet the UK has some of the best funded care in the world. If you look across in other medical systems, it's even worse. And again, you could ask the question, well, why is that? And I think it's fear of death. And it's the same reason why people don't want to make their own wills and make provision for their own funerals and everything else like that. That even health planners are frightened of death and don't want to invest large sums of money in providing resources for end-of-life care. So yes, I think we need to use our influence to try to promote and encourage and celebrate how good expert palliative care is, and say, look, this is a much better and healthier option.
It seems somewhat ironic that the places where euthanasia and assisted suicide are being pushed the most and where the laws are changing are relatively well-resourced Western countries. We don't hear much about a push for it in under-resourced developing countries, for example. Why do you think that is? Is it something to do with an underlying ideology or worldview, or is it just that the pro-euthanasia lobby are not as well organized there? Why this discrepancy?
It's a very good point. And I think my own view is that is because it's the argument from autonomy which is increasingly the dominant argument. Yes, there is still an argument about compassion, about people in pain and all the rest, but that is not the real issue. The real issue is modern people's desire for control over every aspect of their life. And to many, many modern liberal people growing up in rich liberal Western countries, they regard it as just simply outrageous that I can control every other aspect of my life. I can decide where I live, how I spend my money, who I marry, every aspect, how I work and so on. Every aspect of my life is at my choice and control, except I have no control over when and how I die. And they say this is ridiculous. This is the 21st century. And so that is the primary driving force, I think. And of course, that is the argument to which ultimately there is no medical solution. Palliative care doesn't solve that. The only answer is actually the answer of the gospel. The answer of the gospel says that it is in recognizing our dependence that we are ultimately free to be ourselves, and that this desire for control is ultimately a mistake.
Yes, it's fascinating. It came out in your talk, particularly with the Canadian statistics, that what's pushing people to embrace this solution is more existential reasons than medical reasons. It's about loss of meaning and purpose, or not being able to do the things that gave one's life meaning and purpose again. There's another fascinating comment here from a developing world context. Anthony Enemil in West Africa is saying, not sure how to classify this, but in some developing countries, the tradition of some cultures is to prefer expensive funerals for a dead person rather than paying for medications to save lives during life. Family members who could have supported a sick person in the hospital would rather hold on to the financial support, and yet will be very willing to contribute money for a grand funeral for the same person. Is this a form of family euthanasia? That was certainly a new one on me.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I don't know the particular culture in question, but it's certainly true that in many non-Christian cultures across the world, and historically, death has not been seen as an enemy. It is seen as a natural process, and something even, that suicide or ending one's life could be seen as something heroic and rational and appropriate. I mean, many non-Christian cultures have almost had this pro-death view, and it's really cultures which have been influenced by the Christian revelation, who've always seen death as an enemy and have always seen fighting against death. And that's, of course, why medical care, Western scientific medical care, or just basic medical care, really developed within the Christian context, within the early Christian church. And it's because of this sense that death is an enemy, to be resisted, is basically a Christian insight. So we shouldn't be surprised, I think, that in other cultures which haven't been influenced by the Christian revelation, that sometimes there is more this idea that there's no point in spending money to try and fight against death. We should accept death, and instead let's have a good funeral. Mm. But of course, the antithesis of that is that in the West we've taken it to the extreme, where we've now medicalized death. We see fighting against death as the only way. So the Christian view always has this interesting ambiguity. On the one hand, we see death as an enemy, whilst on the other hand, we recognize that there is a time to say enough is enough, and that death changes from being an enemy into a strange kind of healing, something to be accepted, and even a gateway into the new heaven and the new earth.
Absolutely, to something far better. Well, sadly, we've run out of time, but I just wanted to ask you one more question, John, and that was, most of our listeners here are Christian doctors and dentists all around the world. What advice could you give to Christian doctors and dentists who are perhaps becoming more aware of this issue as a result of hearing this talk? How can we get engaged? What contribution can we make in this fight? You've been involved in it for a long time.
Yeah, thanks. I do think that our first priority is to educate ourselves. We really need to get a firm grasp of the relevant information, both medically. We really need to understand how palliative care works, what its philosophy is, how it's different from intentional killing, and we need to understand the Christian foundations of our position. But I think then, secondly, we need to be involved in educating others. I think there's a huge task of educating our colleagues, educating members of the Christian church, and so on. And there are a number of resources to help us. I mean, there are a number of organizations which we mentioned, and we'll attach to the podcast a number of links of organizations, resources, books, and other things which are available to help in this task of education.
Well, thank you very much, Professor John Wyatt, for a wonderfully comprehensive and wide-ranging talk, and for really challenging us in this whole area. So it just remains to me to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to Professor Wyatt and to all of you for coming along and making this so worthwhile. May God bless you, and we hope to see you again